Welcome to Digging Deeper with Backyard Farmer. I'm your host, Kim Todd. On Digging Deeper, we have in-depth discussions with extension and industry experts about those important landscape topics. Today, we're going to start exploring sustainable school gardening. Thank you for joining us once again for Digging Deeper with Backyard Farmer. You know, we've had a number of Digging Deeper programs that focus on getting kids involved with gardening. We're going to take a deeper dive into that tonight with my guests Scott Wieskamp and Brittany Albin from Lincoln Public Schools. So Scott and Brittany, welcome aboard. This is actually our first digging this year where we have two diggers instead of just one. We had a little conversation about your dirt and your plants, and that's because of the color of your shirts. And that's kind of a good way to think about the whole operation of what it takes in a public space to garden at schools, right?
Correct. Well, thanks, Kim. We appreciate being on tonight and just having the opportunity to talk about school gardens and the magnitude of what we deal with on a daily basis. So you want me to start with just give me some background?
I do, because you are a facilities guy overseeing the entire thing, all of them. How many schools?
We have about 70 locations, 70 sites within the city, several hundred acres that equates to. So you can imagine the management of that. And just like the university, Lincoln Public Schools is short on human resources and short on financial resources to do the type of job that we'd really like to do in terms of manicuring our sites. That all being said, that's why we rely on parents and teachers and the community to help us out with community gardens or butterfly gardens, whatever you want to call it. We have a lot of learning spaces on our school sites. Brittany will be able to dive a little deeper into that with some of our discussions tonight, but we appreciate the community's help and support because it is important for us to maintain these gardens. As you know, a lot of times it comes from a teacher that's got a great idea, maybe a parent or a PTO that's got a great idea, and so there's a process that we go through where they have to come to operations in a sense with a request to say, hey, we'd like to have a community garden on our site. And that's where the whole process begins, where we evaluate, okay, where's it going to be? Front yard, side yard, backyard, in a place where it's a reliable location, where it's not going to get vandalized, but it's easy to get access to. Because sometimes we might even have a parent working there during a school day. So we have to make sure that they're not in the middle of the school activities. So we spend a lot of time thinking about where it should go, how it can get managed and maintained. A plan has to be submitted. That's where Brittany again comes in terms of making sure that we have a way to take care of it, because a lot of times a parent may be involved from the day that their kindergartner starts school, but by the time they move on to middle school, they don't have quite the same interest.
Right.
So there's a process there that we need to make sure it's sustainable. And so again, that's where Brittany comes in. She's developed a lot of protocol for the district that really helps us sustain our gardens, which we've done a lot better job the last 5 to 10 years than we did maybe the 10 years prior.
So is this really a trend that has built over the last 10 years? And are you seeing an uptick in our current situation for more and more requests for school gardens and more requests for sustainable practices?
I'll say yes, but I'll let maybe Brittany address that because she's been more involved in reviewing those applications.
Yeah, I'd say that yes, we're seeing an increase in requests and we're seeing an increase in interest for sure. And part of that is just we have tried to communicate that process for approval and doing this a little bit more by the book. So we may have had more requests and things going on in the past, but it wasn't going through this formal process. So that's been a great part of creating. We have a school garden manual that's available on the LPS website, and that includes a lot of details about what it means to get facilities approval, what it means to expand one of those spaces, all those considerations that Scott was talking about. You know, is it going to be in a good location to be successful? Is there water access? Is there something planned for that area of the site that maybe they weren't aware of, but someone in facilities would be? So we're seeing that process formalize. We're seeing them make sure they have a plan before they propose that. And I do think we're seeing just more and more people get on board, that they realize the importance of having this outdoor space for engagement and learning and getting students' hands dirty, learning about all of these topics. And we did definitely see an uptick in making sure that those spaces could be accessible as schools closed and as sites closed. That was something that was brought up a lot of how can we continue making sure that this is available for students and families.
So you mentioned, both of you, the resource issue associated, both the human resource and obviously the financial resource. Do requests come to you with money in hand or grant funding or tax funding? How exactly do these gardens get, or landscapes? I like to call them landscapes because so many of them also include other plant materials for learning. How do they get funded?
Usually the start is just an idea. Somebody's got an idea that they want to have a community garden, or maybe they want to have an educational garden, depending on what the vision is. Mm-hmm. Could come from a staff member, as mentioned. It could come from a parent or a PTO. We always want to make sure the principal is knowledgeable of what the plan is, because the principal ultimately is the one that's accountable for the building and the site. So we get the principal involved, and then we call a meeting and say, okay, let's lay it all out on the table. What do you want here? What's the vision? And that's what begins the catalyst. Okay, once we play out the vision, how are we going to take care of it? What's the sustainability piece? Is it going to cost money, or is it just labor that we can all provide? Is it just time? And so all those things are kind of put out on the table, and that's where kind of some of the guidelines that Brittany's worked on help us work through the process, so that when we're all done, the plan is whole, as opposed to we just have an idea, let's start. And the other thing that Brittany just talked about was COVID has really had an interesting impact, because the passion for those who want to sustain them has shown. Those people have been anxious to be on our sites, and so that's a good thing. Because sometimes we lack that passion, as mentioned, and then they start to deteriorate. And in the summer months, when no kids are around, no parents are around, a lot of times that's when things are growing. And again, that's where the human resources, our grounds department doesn't have the time or the people to go take care of them. So that's where that passion and the important people piece is really critical.
So you mentioned that those summer months, which again, in any 9-month educational system, unless it's open 24/7 and there's people there, is it? You mentioned, of course, that your staff is really not available, short of doing things like mowing and making sure vandalism doesn't happen. How does that happen so that those gardens, by the end of the season, are not just dreadful when kids come back?
Yeah. I can talk more about that, of just some examples we've seen, because the answer to all of this is that every school is different. Right. No neighborhood is the same, no school is the same in terms of how this is going to work best for their garden, for their landscape. But we have seen different successful models and how they can carry it over through the summer. So one of our biggest partners and advocates for these types of spaces has been our CLCs, our community learning centers. And a lot of those programs do happen over the summer. It might not be every day or the whole time, but they are still on the site, and they have students and they have staff, and they're still engaged. So that's one way we see it being successful over the summer. Other sites, they may not have that, or the CLC isn't involved with that space, or just doesn't have the capacity. So we have parents who are setting up a schedule. So maybe this week, this family's in charge of watering and weeding, and the next week it's a different family, and they're coming up with online schedules and signups to keep that going. We've seen that be a really successful model. But that's also a big question that when you're starting up, we need to talk about that, of what do you envision the plan being, and that may change over time. But a lot of people may think, oh, there's just going to be someone that will take care of it, or we'll find some partner that will have all this time, or we'll find someone who wants to do that. But it's really important to make sure that there's multiple people involved and multiple people willing to take on that responsibility over the summer, because that is when it's thriving most. And we want to make sure, how are we still engaging kids with those spaces over the summer too? We hope it doesn't just fall to some adult taking care of it, because that's when there's so much to learn and have them interact with that space and what they're growing.
Exactly. And I know we have some schools that master gardeners have adopted.
Exactly.
And, they have their schedule. And bringing those kinds of people in too, maybe it can transcend a little bit that my kid just graduated from 5th grade and I'm not really interested anymore. So I think that's probably something that you take advantage of as well.
And you mentioned the Master Gardener program, and we do have a handful of schools that have that type of a partnership, and we're very fortunate for that. And there are a number, we have a few others where we might have a retired couple who's just said, hey, we're going to adopt that school, which is really great because, quite frankly, they don't live around the school year, they live around the full year. And they are out there during the summer months taking good care of things. And so, no pun intended, but I wish we could grow more of those partnerships because we could sustain these on more sites. And that's the challenge, is getting those partners that are there when kids and staff are not.
Exactly. We want to make sure that you weigh in on Facebook and give us your comments. Tell us what you think about what we're talking about today. And of course, the kinds of things that Scott and Brittany are bringing up apply to any school situation. This is not just Lincoln. It just so happens that Lincoln's a little closer to home than bringing in somebody from, say, Scotts Bluff for just a 20-minute conversation. So make sure you weigh in on this one. So let's go back then to gardens get planned, processes, budget, the thought process for keeping this sustainable, not just in terms of the landscape, the plants, but the ongoing use of that space. They get planted in April, May, probably, and then managed over the summer and into the winter months, usually, because kids come back, right?
Yep.
What happens if 5, 6, 7 years down the road, one just kind of deteriorates? Who is responsible for removing that, or what do you do if a school landscape or a school garden essentially fails?
First of all, hopefully we wouldn't allow it to fail for several years. We would have those communications with the principal and staff to make sure that, okay, is this something that you want to sustain at your building or not? So those conversations would take place first, and if they said, you know what, we just don't have the resources to take care of it, we wish it would go away, then our grounds crew would come in and make it disappear, and we'd go back to grass or landscaping or whatever was likely there prior to that time. So we have not done that as often lately because our partnerships are much stronger, but we used to do that a lot. It would not have surprised me if we weren't doing that 2 or 3 buildings per summer in the past, but quite frankly, I don't remember. It's probably been 2 or 3 years since we've done that to one of our facilities, so the partnerships are much stronger.
Well, that's pretty exciting too, because that also means that young people and their parents are enthused by the education and the hands-on and the fact that this is a part of the school curriculum, which I think is just tremendously good opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that's hopefully part of the role that I'm playing in this as the sustainability coordinator for the district. This position hasn't always existed, but now that it does, being that intervention, whereas before there just weren't the staff and the resources to try to come up with a solution. Now that's what I see my role is, okay, we're having a challenge at this school or this site. What partners might be able to step in? What connections can we tap into? Whereas before there just wasn't enough capacity to try to make those connections and try to revive it. And that's where we're seeing what are all of those components that will make it lasting, because it isn't just who's that passionate person that's going to propose this project, but how do we get as many people at the site engaged in it and as many people in the neighborhood engaged with it, because we know whoever that person is, their kids will move on or they'll retire or whatever that circumstance may be, they maybe just get busy. So it can't depend on that one person. And I think that's what we've been trying to perfect with all of these guidelines and resources and communication, is just how do we get enough people interested and supported so that it can be more resilient.
So this is maybe an off-the-wall question a little bit, but so many of these gardens, the whole purpose is let's see where your food comes from.
Right.
Do you have concerns, or do you hear concerns about, well, my kid ate something in your garden, or can we go in and pick and eat? How do you deal with that in your protocol?
You know, that's a good question, and I'll let Brittany address that a little bit further, but the whole growing food is another piece of this, because you can look at it, are we growing food, crop, or are we growing plants and vegetation and landscaping? I mean, so there's a couple of differences there in terms of what these gardens might be based on the educational perspective. We do have some partnerships with community crops that we can talk about where we are growing food. And quite frankly, I think those could probably expand because we have area on many sites to allow that to happen. But I've not really had a call yet in my tenure that says, hey, you've got some bad food out there and our kids have been eating it. I think that's part of the educational process, not to go out and experiment and eat something off the vine, but I think the fact is that kids need to learn that. They need to be involved in knowing where food comes from because that resource is getting more difficult to come by now. And so, I don't know if
Yeah, and I'll just add, that's typically happening in an informal setting, so we aren't, I guess, held to those same risks in terms of if this was maybe being served in the cafeteria.
Right.
Which there are plenty of schools and examples out there across the country that is more of a goal. And we certainly, our nutrition services department does have that farm to school component and brings those pieces in. But with our school gardens, it's typically more of an informal or even after school setting. They've probably signed a permission form with their parents to even be part of the garden club. So it kind of just becomes part of that. Or it might even be the parents themselves are coming and harvesting and they're bringing it home to their families. So they're kind of having that whole experience together.
Well, and you also mentioned the other things that eat, which of course is the pollinators. And I would suspect that so many of your schools are probably wanting the pollinator garden, if not first, as a part of this whole experience. So it's, you know, the insects eat, then we eat. That would become then maybe more attractive when things are in flower, which would mean you bring the community in, you start to get that interaction again that you talked about that's so important in getting people to understand what's going on in these public spaces, very public spaces.
I believe our requests that we're getting now probably lean more to a pollinator garden than they do a community crop type of a garden, and Brittany can expand on that because we have more and more of both, but I think the pollinator garden has probably been the driver in the past.
Well, and there's been more funding available in the community, I think, for pollinator gardens because it's been such a need and there's been so much education around it. So that is also part of why I think there's been more support for that. But also it just makes a great educational space, and it's a little less intimidating than trying to maintain raised beds or, you know, growing food. That can be a good first step, which is great. We, you know, with all of this planning and the proposals we get in, we like them to think long-term vision, but also start off small so they don't get overwhelmed and build too much that they can't maintain.
Right, exactly. So I think, you know, maybe one parting question here would be, let's say a group comes to you when school opens this fall and they want to put in a garden this fall.
We have one of those.
Right now you've got one.
But you can't come to us this fall and expect it to happen this fall.
Right.
The process probably takes a little longer than that. What Brittany's referencing probably started a few months ago.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But if you were interested, I would start with the principal and say, hey, we'd love to support this facility, this school, your kids here with a project, and start the discussion there, and then we'd get involved pretty quickly.
Right, and I sense a lot of enthusiasm on both of your parts for this entire process, which again, you know, growing up and going to school just a few years ago, we didn't have school gardens and we didn't have this kind of thing. It was, you know, there was a piece of play equipment and a tree or two. And so I'm really pleased, and I'm sure your clients are too, to be able to see that this is the way that LPS is handling these kinds of requests.
And I have to give Brittany a lot of credit for that because she's built this program to where it is since she's been on board the last 5 or so years. So.
Yeah, excellent. So do you want to give our viewers the URL to be able to access your gardens? And we will make sure they do that.
Yeah, so you're just going to go to lps.org, so our LPS website, and if you keyword search sustainability, then you'll end up on that website, and the school garden is right on there. School garden manual is right on there, and you can also see we've tried to pull together stories from school gardens across our community and how those are being managed, and you can see some photos on there of existing gardens.
That's just awesome. Well, you know, that is all the time we have for Digging Deeper with Backyard Farmer. I want to say thanks to Scott and Brittany for coming in and talking to us today. We will be back next week with part 2 of our discussion of sustainable school gardens. Do be sure to watch Backyard Farmer live every Thursday at 7 p.m. Central on NET. Thanks for Digging Deeper with Backyard Farmer.